HOA cut open my driveway while I was away. Then the county asked for their permit. Before we dive into today's story, I'd like to ask you one small favor. Tell me where you're watching from by leaving the name of your city, state, or country in the comments below. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel and reading where everyone is tuning in from. Thank you for being here. Now, let me tell you what happened. Some people think the worst thing an HOA can do is send a warning letter. They have no idea what happens when they decide your property belongs to them. My name is Ethan Carter, and until that Tuesday morning, I believed the same thing. I was more than 600 miles from home, sitting through the second day of a commercial construction conference outside Denver, nursing a cup of burnt hotel coffee while pretending to pay attention to a presentation about drainage systems. My phone had been on silent since breakfast. Around 8:17 a.m., it buzzed 3 times in rapid succession. I almost ignored it. Instead, I glanced down and saw a message from my next-door neighbor, Mike. There were no words at first, just 3 photos. The first image showed a bright orange concrete saw parked at the end of my driveway. The second captured 2 workers wearing reflective vests standing beside a trench that hadn't existed the day before. The third stopped me cold. A jagged cut stretched across the entire width of my driveway, running from one edge to the other like a scar carved into fresh stone. Dust hung in the air, frozen by the camera, while yellow caution cones blocked the entrance to my garage. I stared at the screen, convinced I had somehow opened someone else's pictures. Then Mike's text arrived beneath them. "Ethan, did you know they were doing this?" My stomach tightened. I stepped out into the hallway and called him immediately. He answered on the first ring. Before I could say anything, he sighed. "I figured you didn't know. What's going on?" I asked. "Who authorized this?" There was a brief silence before he answered. "Linda said the HOA approved maintenance work. They started early this morning. They said it couldn't wait." Linda Brooks. Hearing her name immediately raised every alarm in my head. She had been president of our HOA for almost 4 years, and during that time she had developed a habit of treating suggestions like laws and opinions like legal authority. She always smiled while saying things that sounded official enough for most people to stop asking questions. Most of the neighborhood did exactly that. I never enjoyed arguing with her, but I had learned something important over the years. Whenever Linda sounded the most confident, that was usually when I needed to start reading the paperwork. "Did they say what kind of maintenance?" I asked. Mike laughed quietly. "Depends who you asked. One worker said drainage improvements. Another said utility access. Linda told Mrs. Patterson they're protecting neighborhood infrastructure." None of those answers made sense. My driveway wasn't shared property. It sat entirely within my recorded lot lines except for a small utility easement near the sidewalk, and even that area had strict procedures attached to any excavation. I knew because I had reviewed my survey before replacing the driveway 5 years earlier. You couldn't simply show up with heavy equipment and start cutting concrete because someone on the HOA board felt like it. "Did anyone from the county come by?" I asked. "Not that I saw." "Any utility trucks?" "Nope." I thanked him and ended the call, but I couldn't concentrate on the conference anymore. I opened the photos again, zooming in on every detail. Fresh sawdust, tire tracks from a skid steer, orange paint markings that looked strangely incomplete. Something else caught my attention. I couldn't find a single permit notice posted anywhere near the work zone. Maybe it was hidden outside the frame. Maybe they had already removed it. Or maybe it had never existed in the first place. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. There could be a perfectly reasonable explanation waiting for me back home. Still, one thought refused to leave my mind. If everything had been done properly, why had nobody bothered to tell the homeowner before slicing through his driveway? As I booked the earliest flight home, I looked at those photos one more time. Everyone else probably saw broken concrete. I saw something much smaller, almost invisible. A missing permit number. And somehow, I couldn't shake the feeling that tiny missing detail was about to become the biggest mistake the HOA had ever made. I landed just after sunrise the next morning, picked up my truck from the airport parking garage, and drove straight home without stopping for breakfast. The closer I got to my neighborhood, the tighter my grip became on the steering wheel. Part of me still hoped Mike's photos had exaggerated the damage or that the crew had already finished and restored everything before I returned. That hope disappeared the moment I turned onto my street. Bright orange traffic cones still lined the curb in front of my house. A temporary construction sign leaned crookedly against my mailbox. Fine gray concrete dust covered the edge of my lawn like someone had sprinkled ash across the grass overnight. I slowed to a crawl, rolled down the window, and immediately smelled fresh cement mixed with the sharp odor of asphalt sealant. It was the unmistakable scent of a job that had been started but not completed. When I pulled into the driveway, I could not. The trench stretched from one side of the concrete to the other, cutting directly across the entrance just a few feet from the sidewalk. Fresh saw marks were perfectly straight, but the repair itself looked uneven, as if different crews had started making decisions halfway through the project. Tire tracks from heavy equipment had pressed deep into the edge of my lawn, leaving muddy impressions that curved toward the street. I stepped out of the truck and simply stood there in silence. 5 years earlier, I had saved for months to replace that driveway. I had hired a licensed contractor, verified every inspection, and kept every receipt neatly filed in a cabinet inside my home office. It had never been just a slab of concrete to me. It represented years of careful planning and hard work. Hearing footsteps behind me, I turned and saw Mike walking across his yard with a concerned expression. He shook his head before saying a single word. "They wrapped up yesterday afternoon," he said. Nobody seemed interested in explaining much. "Did anyone ask questions?" I replied. "Plenty of people did." Nobody got the same answer twice. That sentence stayed with me because it fit Linda Brooks perfectly. Whenever facts became inconvenient, she replaced them with confidence. As if summoned by the mention of her name, a white sport utility vehicle slowly pulled up along the curb. Linda stepped out wearing sunglasses, carrying a clipboard under one arm, and smiling with the calm expression of someone who believed the situation was already settled. "Good morning, Ethan," she said. "I heard you got back late." "I did," I answered evenly. "Would you mind telling me why my driveway was cut open while I was out of state?" She barely glanced toward the trench before looking back at me. "It was necessary maintenance approved by the association. Everything was handled according to community guidelines." I nodded slowly. "What kind of maintenance?" "Infrastructure improvements." "What infrastructure?" "Neighborhood infrastructure." "Which department requested it?" For the first time, her smile hesitated. "Our engineering people reviewed everything." "Who are your engineering people?" She shifted the clipboard slightly. "The board relied on professional recommendations." Every answer seemed carefully designed to sound complete while revealing absolutely nothing. I noticed she never mentioned a company name, an engineering report, or any public agency. She simply repeated broad phrases that could not easily be challenged in casual conversation. I looked down at the repair again. Near the curb, someone had sprayed orange utility markings, but several lines stopped abruptly before reaching the cut itself. That struck me as unusual. Every legitimate utility project I had ever seen followed a consistent pattern from start to finish. This looked incomplete, almost improvised. "Can I have a copy of the work order?" I asked. "The association keeps those records." "Then I would also like the engineering report." "You can submit a records request." "I will. And I would like the contractor's name." "That information is available through the board." "Good." I paused for a moment before asking the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind since I first saw Mike's photographs. "What is the permit number?" Linda blinked once. The confident rhythm of the conversation disappeared. "I would have to check our files." "Please do. The office handles documentation." Then I looked forward to reading it. She gave a polite smile that no longer reached her eyes, wished me a pleasant afternoon, and returned to her vehicle without another word. As she drove away, Mike quietly stepped beside me. "That was different," he said. "Usually she has an answer for everything." I kept watching the sport utility vehicle until it disappeared around the corner. "She still thinks she does," I replied. The difference is that today I asked for the one answer she probably never expected to need. The next morning I walked into my home office, unlocked the gray filing cabinet beside my desk, and pulled out a folder that most people would have considered excessive. Inside were my property survey, the original driveway contract, inspection approvals, invoices, photographs from the installation, and every communication related to the work completed 5 years earlier. Friends had joked that I kept records like an accountant preparing for an audit. Maybe they were right. I had never imagined those papers would become important again, but I had learned long ago that organized documents often settled disagreements faster than raised voices ever could. I spread everything across the dining room table and compared the survey with the photographs Mike had sent me. The trench appeared dangerously close to the utility easement shown near the sidewalk, but without official measurements, I could not say whether it crossed into it or stopped just short. Either way, one question continued to outweigh every other concern. Who had authorized excavation on private property? Instead of calling Linda again, I decided to follow the process exactly the way any reasonable homeowner should. I opened my laptop, logged into the association's homeowner portal, and submitted a formal records request. I kept it simple and professional. I requested a copy of the board resolution approving the project, the engineering report recommending the work, the contractor agreement, any notices sent to affected homeowners, and the excavation permit number associated with the project. I read the request twice before pressing send. There was nothing emotional in my message. No accusations. No threats. Just a request for documents that should have existed if everything had been done correctly. Less than an hour later, an automatic confirmation appeared in my inbox stating that my request had been received and would be processed according to association policy. That was expected. What happened next was not. By late afternoon, I received a short email from the association office. It thanked me for my patience and stated that several of the requested documents were being gathered. However, it made no mention whatsoever of the permit number. That omission immediately caught my attention. They had acknowledged every other request, yet somehow skipped the one document that should have been the easiest to identify. Curious, I searched the county's online public records portal. Most construction permits could be located by address, parcel number, or contractor name. I entered my property address carefully and waited for the results to load. Landscaping permits from previous years appeared. A roofing permit from my neighbor's house appeared. My own driveway replacement permit from 5 years earlier appeared exactly where I expected it. But there was nothing connected to the recent excavation. I tried different search filters. I searched by street name. I searched by date. I even searched nearby addresses in case someone had accidentally filed the work under the wrong parcel. Still nothing. That did not automatically prove no permit existed. Government databases occasionally took time to update. Even so, I found the absence difficult to ignore. The following morning, I called the contractor listed on one of the temporary equipment stickers visible in Mike's photographs. After navigating through several menu options, I finally reached a receptionist who transferred me to a project manager. I introduced myself and explained that excavation work had recently been completed at my property. There was a brief pause before he answered. "Let me pull up the file." I listened to the clicking of a keyboard for nearly 30 seconds. "I see the neighborhood," he finally said. "Can you confirm the project number?" "I do not have one," I replied. "I was hoping you could provide it." Another silence followed. "I would need to speak with our field supervisor before discussing active projects." "That is perfectly fine," I said. "Could you also tell me the permit number associated with the excavation?" The line became noticeably quieter. "I am not able to see that information from my screen." "Who would have it?" "Someone will call you back." He ended the conversation politely, but I noticed he never actually answered the question. By the end of the day, no return call had come. I looked once more at the growing stack of papers covering my dining room table. Individually, none of the missing pieces proved anything. Together, they formed a pattern that became harder to dismiss. The association avoided the permit number. The contractor could not provide it. The county database did not display it. I had started this process expecting to verify that everything had been handled correctly. Instead, every document I found seemed to point toward one document that nobody wanted to produce. Over the next several days, I stopped looking for dramatic breakthroughs and started paying attention to small inconsistencies instead. They were everywhere once I slowed down enough to notice them. The first arrived in the form of the association's response to my records request. A packet finally appeared in my mailbox containing several photocopied documents. There was a board meeting agenda mentioning neighborhood infrastructure. There was a contractor proposal with large portions redacted for what the association called confidential business information. There was even a short notice claiming maintenance had been scheduled to improve long-term drainage. What was missing stood out more than everything they had included. There was still no engineering report identifying a specific problem beneath my driveway, and there was still no excavation permit. Instead, a single sentence near the end of the letter stated that any additional documentation would be provided if available. That wording bothered me. If available did not sound like the language of an organization that had carefully planned a construction project. It sounded like someone hoping the question would quietly disappear. Rather than responding immediately, I decided to verify every claim one by one. The drainage explanation seemed like the easiest place to begin. During the previous 5 years, I had never experienced standing water in my driveway, not even after heavy summer storms that dropped several inches of rain in a single afternoon. I opened a folder containing photographs from those storms because I had documented the property while planning landscaping improvements. Every image showed clean drainage flowing toward the curb exactly as designed. I compared those pictures with the association's recent explanation and found no obvious reason that would justify emergency excavation. The next inconsistency came from my neighbors. Mrs. Patterson told me Linda had described the project as preventive maintenance. Across the street, Daniel remembered hearing that utility access was required. Mike insisted one worker had mentioned replacing an underground line. 3 different explanations had been given to 3 different people about the same project. None of them matched the limited paperwork the association had mailed to me. The more conversations I had, the more careful I became about taking notes. Dates, times, names, exact wording. I was no longer trying to win an argument. I was trying to understand why every version of the story seemed slightly different. Late that afternoon, my telephone finally rang. The caller identified himself as the field supervisor from the contractor's company, returning my earlier message. His voice was polite but cautious. After confirming my address, he explained that his crew had performed work according to instructions received from the client. I asked whether an engineer had been present before excavation began. He answered that he had not personally attended the planning meeting. I asked whether underground utilities had been marked before the saw cut was made. He replied that markings had been visible when the crew arrived. That answer immediately reminded me of the incomplete orange paint I had noticed near the curb. Then I asked the same question I had been asking everyone else. Can you tell me the excavation permit number for the project? There was another pause, longer this time. Permit documentation is normally handled by the project owner, he finally said. In this case, who is the project owner? I asked. The association coordinated the work, so they would have the permit. You would need to speak with them. The conversation remained courteous from beginning to end, yet it left me exactly where I had started. Every road seemed to lead back to the association, and every answer stopped just before the one piece of information I actually needed. That evening, I drove slowly through the neighborhood and looked at several nearby driveways. Mine was the only one that had been cut open. If this had truly been a community infrastructure project, why had only one homeowner been affected? I parked across the street from my house and studied the repair as the sun dipped lower behind the trees. The concrete had already begun curing, but the color difference between the old surface and the new patch made the work impossible to ignore. It looked less like planned maintenance and more like a permanent reminder that someone had made a decision without first asking the person who owned the property. As I gathered my notes and returned inside, one conclusion became impossible to avoid. The documents did not support the explanations. The explanations did not match the witnesses. The witnesses did not agree with each other. Somewhere between those conflicting stories was the truth, and I had a growing feeling that it would not be uncovered by another conversation with the association. It would require someone who cared less about neighborhood politics and far more about whether the rules had actually been followed. The following morning, I organized every photograph, email, survey, and note into a single folder before driving to the county administration building. I was not looking for someone to punish the association. At that point, I simply wanted one straightforward answer. Either the excavation had been authorized properly, or it had not. The receptionist directed me to the public works counter, where a staff member patiently listened as I explained the situation. I placed the photographs of my driveway on the counter beside a copy of my property survey and the correspondence from the association. She studied each page carefully without interrupting. When she reached the photograph showing the trench across my driveway, her expression became noticeably more focused. "Do you happen to have the permit number?" she asked. "That is exactly what I have been trying to obtain," I replied. She typed my address into her computer and searched several databases. After a minute, she searched again using the parcel number from my survey. Then she tried the street name by itself. Finally, she leaned back slightly and said, "I am not finding an active excavation permit connected to this address." She was careful with her words. She did not tell me no permit existed. She simply explained that nothing appeared in the county records available to her. She asked whether I would mind waiting a few minutes while she spoke with another department. About 15 minutes later, a county inspector named David Morales introduced himself and invited me into a small meeting room. He thanked me for bringing documentation instead of relying only on verbal descriptions. That immediately gave me confidence because it confirmed I had approached the situation the right way. I handed him the same folder I had organized the night before. He examined each page in silence, occasionally making notes with a blue pen. He compared the property survey with the photographs, looked at the association's letter, and paused when he reached the page where the permit number should have been referenced. "Has anyone from the county inspected the work since it was completed?" he asked. "Not that I know of," I answered. "Did the association provide you with engineering plans?" "No." "Did they provide notice identifying the specific utility involved?" "No." He nodded slowly without offering any opinion. Instead, he opened another map on his computer showing easements, utility corridors, and public rights-of-way surrounding my neighborhood. He traced a line across the screen before turning it toward me. "Based on what I am seeing," he said, "there are several questions that should be answered before anyone performs excavation in this area." Those words were calm, professional, and completely free of accusation, yet they carried far more weight than all of Linda's confident explanations combined. David explained that county procedures existed to protect homeowners, contractors, underground utilities, and public infrastructure alike. Depending on the scope and location of the work, permits, inspections, and utility coordination could all become important parts of the process. He made it equally clear that he could not reach conclusions from photographs alone. The site would need to be inspected in person. I appreciated that approach because it focused on facts rather than assumptions. Before our meeting ended, he asked one final question. "Would you be available tomorrow morning if I visit the property?" "Absolutely," I replied without hesitation. "I will be there." He closed the folder and handed it back to me. "Bring any additional documentation you receive from the association. We will compare everything at the site." As I walked back to my truck, I realized something important had changed. Up until that moment, every conversation had taken place entirely within the neighborhood. The association controlled the narrative, decided which documents to share, and answered only the questions it wanted to answer. Now the discussion had moved outside that circle. An independent county inspector would evaluate the property using official records instead of neighborhood opinions. That evening, I received another electronic message from the association. It informed homeowners that routine infrastructure work had been completed successfully and thanked everyone for their cooperation. I read the announcement twice before setting my phone aside. The timing felt almost too convenient. Less than 24 hours earlier, I had requested documentation. Earlier that afternoon, I had spoken with the county. Now the association was publicly describing the project as finished. I looked out my front window at the uneven strip of fresh concrete crossing my driveway. By the next morning, someone from the county would be standing exactly where I was standing now, asking questions that could no longer be answered with vague phrases or confident smiles. The next morning arrived with clear skies and unusually cool air for late summer. At exactly 8:30, a white county pickup turned onto my street and stopped in front of my house. David Morales stepped out carrying a clipboard, a measuring wheel, and a tablet. There was nothing dramatic about his arrival, and somehow that made the moment feel even more significant. He was not there to take anyone's side. He was there to verify facts. I walked over to greet him and handed him another copy of the property survey along with the association's latest correspondence. He thanked me, tucked the documents into a folder, and began examining the driveway without making a single comment. He first measured the distance from the curb to the fresh cut across the concrete, recording each measurement on his tablet before comparing it with the survey map. He then followed the trench from one edge of the driveway to the other, stopping several times to study the repair more closely. After that, he looked toward the faded orange utility markings near the sidewalk. He crouched for a moment, traced one of the paint lines with his finger, and quietly took several photographs. Watching him work reminded me how different a professional inspection looked compared to neighborhood speculation. Every movement had a purpose. Every observation was documented. Nothing depended on opinion. About 20 minutes into the inspection, another vehicle pulled into the street. Linda Brooks stepped out carrying the same clipboard I had seen earlier in the week. She smiled politely at David before introducing herself as president of the Homeowners Association. David returned the greeting with the same calm professionalism he had shown me and asked a simple question. Do you have the project documentation with you today? Linda immediately handed him several papers from her clipboard. He reviewed them carefully without speaking. After a minute, he looked back up. I see the contractor proposal and the board authorization, he said. May I also see the excavation permit? For the first time since I had known Linda, she did not answer immediately. She adjusted the papers in her hands before replying that the contractor normally handled permitting requirements. David nodded and made a short note on his tablet. Do you have a copy available? He asked. Not with me, she replied. Can it be provided electronically? Another brief pause followed. I would need to contact the contractor. David simply wrote another note. There was no frustration in his voice and no accusation in his expression. He continued moving through his checklist as though this were just another routine inspection. Next, he asked whether underground utilities had been marked before excavation began. Linda answered that all required procedures had been followed to the best of her knowledge. David looked toward the incomplete orange paint markings again and photographed them from several different angles. He then asked for the engineering report recommending excavation at this specific location. Linda explained that the board had relied on professional advice but did not have the report with her. Once again, David quietly entered another note into his tablet. The entire conversation remained remarkably polite, yet I could sense the atmosphere changing. Earlier in the week, Linda had spoken with complete confidence because every discussion had taken place within the neighborhood, where broad explanations often went unchallenged. Standing beside a county inspector was different. Every statement naturally led to a document, and every document either existed or it did not. There was very little room for assumptions. After completing his measurements, David walked to the edge of the driveway, where the repair crossed near the utility easement shown on my survey. He compared the map with the physical location, took additional photographs, and then turned toward both of us. I will need to review today's findings together with the county records, he said. There are still several items that require clarification before this file can be closed. Linda quickly responded that the association would cooperate fully and provide any requested information. David thanked her and asked that any remaining documentation, including permit records, engineering recommendations, and contractor coordination materials, be submitted directly to his office as soon as possible. He emphasized that complete records would help resolve the matter efficiently. As he packed away his measuring wheel, I noticed something that had not been there when the morning began. The confidence in Linda's voice had faded just enough for anyone paying attention to hear it. She was no longer explaining what had happened. She was promising that documents would eventually appear. After David drove away, the street became quiet again, but it no longer felt the same. For days I had been asking a single question that nobody wanted to answer. Now that exact question had been entered into an official county inspection file, and from that moment forward, it was no longer just my concern. It had become part of a formal review that depended on evidence instead of assurances. 3 days passed without a single update from the association, but the silence itself felt different now. Before the county inspection, every unanswered question had simply disappeared into vague promises and carefully worded emails. Now there was an official file attached to those questions, and deadlines had a way of making silence much louder. On the 4th morning, I was trimming the edge of my lawn when Mike walked over holding his phone. You might want to see this, he said. He showed me an email that had just been sent to every homeowner in the neighborhood. The association announced that a special board meeting would be held later that evening to discuss ongoing infrastructure matters. What immediately caught my attention was a single sentence near the bottom. The board requested attendance from representatives of the construction company to answer technical questions from residents. That had not been part of the original plan. It looked as though someone suddenly wanted the contractor present. I attended the meeting that evening along with nearly 40 homeowners, far more than normally showed up. The atmosphere felt noticeably different from previous board meetings. Instead of casual conversations before the meeting started, people quietly compared printed copies of the association's recent emails. Several neighbors who had never questioned the board before now seemed genuinely curious about what had happened. Linda opened the meeting with her usual confident tone, thanking everyone for their patience and describing the driveway project as a successful improvement completed for the benefit of the community. Then she introduced a representative from the contracting company. The project manager stood, adjusted his glasses, and politely explained the scope of the work as his company had understood it. He emphasized that his crew had performed only the excavation and repair requested by the client. When the floor opened for homeowner questions, I raised my hand. Linda acknowledged me with a measured smile. "I have one simple question," I said. "Has the county received the excavation permit requested during last week's inspection?" The room became completely still. Every conversation stopped. Even homeowners who had been looking down at their papers glanced toward the front of the room. Linda turned toward the contractor's representative before answering. "Permit coordination was part of the construction process," she said carefully. The contractor looked surprised for just a moment before responding. "Our company normally performs work based on documentation provided by the project owner unless permitting responsibilities are specifically assigned under the contract." I watched Linda's expression change almost imperceptibly. She looked back toward him. "My understanding was that your company handled those requirements." He politely shook his head. "Not under this agreement." Several homeowners quietly exchanged looks. Nobody interrupted. Nobody raised a voice. The documents were beginning to speak for themselves. One resident sitting near the back asked whether the board had received an engineering recommendation before approving excavation on private property. Linda replied that the board had relied on professional guidance during its decision-making process. "May we see that report?" another homeowner asked. Linda glanced down at the papers in front of her before explaining that additional documentation was still being gathered. The contractor remained silent. For the first time since this situation began, I realized that the board and the contractor were no longer presenting one unified explanation. Each answer shifted responsibility slightly toward the other side. Neither openly accused the other of making a mistake, but neither accepted complete responsibility either. The meeting ended earlier than usual with Linda assuring everyone that additional information would be shared after communication with county officials was complete. As homeowners filed toward the parking lot, conversations immediately broke out in small groups. Several neighbors approached me, asking whether the county inspection had actually taken place. I simply answered honestly, "Yes. The inspector requested documentation. That is all I know." I avoided speculation because I had learned something valuable throughout this process. Facts carried far more weight than assumptions. The following afternoon, my telephone rang again. It was David Morales. His voice remained calm and professional, but this time there was a noticeable sense of progress. He explained that the county had completed an initial review of the documents submitted so far. Several requested records had still not been provided, including documentation related to permitting and engineering review. He could not discuss every detail while the review remained open, but he informed me that formal requests for additional information had now been sent to the appropriate parties. Before ending the call, he added one sentence that stayed with me long after we hung up. "Once official records are requested," he said, "they either appear or they do not." I thanked him, set my phone on the kitchen counter, and looked through the front window at the repaired strip crossing my driveway. For nearly 2 weeks, I had been searching for one missing document. Now the county was searching for it as well, and unlike neighborhood conversations, official requests could not be answered with confident speeches or carefully chosen phrases. They required evidence. The official letter arrived the following Monday in a plain white envelope with the county seal printed in the upper left corner. I opened it at my kitchen table with the same calm curiosity that had carried me through every step of this process. After weeks of unanswered questions, I had stopped expecting dramatic surprises. Instead, I had learned to pay attention to the exact wording of official documents. Every sentence mattered. The letter explained that the county's preliminary review had been completed and that several required records requested from the association and the project participants had either not been produced or remained incomplete at the time of review. Because of those unresolved issues, the matter would continue through the county's administrative process. Attached to the letter was a summary of the inspection findings. I read it twice before setting it down. Nothing in the report sounded emotional or sensational. It simply listed observations, referenced applicable procedures, and documented missing records. Somehow that calm language carried far more weight than any heated argument ever could. 2 days later, David Morales called again and asked whether I would be available during the afternoon. When I arrived at the property, Another county vehicle was already parked nearby. David greeted me politely and explained that additional measurements had been completed and that responses received from the association had been compared against county records. While he could not discuss every internal detail, he confirmed that the documentation submitted still failed to resolve several important questions identified during the inspection. As we spoke, another vehicle pulled onto the street. Linda stepped out carrying a thick binder that looked far heavier than the clipboard she had confidently carried only a week earlier. She walked toward David with an expression that was noticeably more restrained than before. After exchanging greetings, she handed him the binder and explained that the association had gathered additional materials for review. David accepted the documents and began turning through them page by page. He paused several times, comparing pages against notes already stored on his tablet. Finally, he looked up and asked a familiar question. Do these materials include the excavation permit associated with the work completed at this address? Linda hesitated before answering that the association had been unable to locate a permit issued specifically for the excavation because the board had relied on the contractor's understanding of the project requirements. David made another note before calmly replying. Our records indicate that responsibility for demonstrating compliance remains with the parties directing the work. There was no accusation in his voice, only a statement of procedure. The contractor's representative arrived a few minutes later after being requested by the county. He reviewed portions of the binder and explained that his company had completed only the work authorized by the client under the written agreement. When David asked whether his company had obtained an excavation permit for this specific location, the representative answered that no such permit had been issued through his office because that responsibility had not been assigned under the contract. For several quiet seconds, nobody spoke. It was the first moment since this entire situation began that every explanation lined up clearly enough to reveal what had actually happened. The board believed someone else had handled a critical requirement. The contractor believed that responsibility remained with the association. Neither side could produce the document everyone had assumed existed. David closed the binder and explained that the county would proceed according to its established administrative process. The unresolved documentation, inspection findings, and submitted records would all become part of the official file. Any corrective actions or additional requirements would be communicated directly to the responsible parties. Linda thanked him politely, but the confidence that had defined every earlier conversation had disappeared completely. She no longer spoke as someone explaining a finished project. She sounded like someone trying to understand how so many assumptions had turned into official questions. Later that week, another notice was distributed to every homeowner in the community. This one was very different from the earlier announcements celebrating successful infrastructure improvements. The board informed residents that additional review was underway, that certain project expenses could increase due to administrative requirements, and that corrective work might become necessary depending on the outcome of the county's review. Reading those words, I realized the entire situation had quietly reversed itself. In the beginning, I had stood alone in my driveway asking for one simple document, while everyone else assured me that everything had been handled properly. Now the association itself was informing the entire neighborhood that further review and possible corrective action were required. The concrete across my driveway had not changed since the day I returned home, but everything surrounding it had. Confidence had been replaced by documentation. Assumptions had been replaced by records, and the questions that once belonged only to me now belonged to the official process itself. Nearly 6 weeks after I first stepped out of an airport shuttle and stared at the cut across my driveway, another envelope from the county arrived in my mailbox. By then, I had stopped feeling anxious every time I saw official paperwork. I had learned that the truth moved more slowly than rumors, but it also traveled much farther. I carried the envelope inside, sat at the same kitchen table where I had organized my first stack of photographs, and carefully opened it. The letter explained that the county's administrative review had been completed. Based on the inspection findings, the submitted records, and the documentation provided during the investigation, corrective measures had been required before the matter could be considered resolved. Over the following weeks, those corrective actions had finally been completed. A licensed contractor, working under properly documented authorization and county oversight, removed the inadequate repair and restored my driveway according to approved specifications. Every inspection was documented. Every stage was recorded. Every required approval appeared exactly where it should have from the beginning. A separate notice informed me that responsibility for the restoration costs had been assigned through the administrative process and related agreements between the involved parties. I did not celebrate when I read those words. I simply felt relieved. The driveway looked the way it had before anyone touched it, but getting there had required something far more valuable than concrete. It had required accountability. A few days later, the association held another board meeting. Attendance was higher than I had ever seen. This time, there were no speeches about successful infrastructure improvements or broad promises about protecting the neighborhood. Instead, the board announced several policy changes. Future projects affecting private property would require documented homeowner notification, complete engineering records when applicable, and confirmation that all necessary governmental approvals had been obtained before work could begin. Those changes were approved unanimously. As the meeting ended, Linda approached me near the exit. She looked tired, and for the first time since I had known her, she spoke without the confidence that had once filled every conversation. She said quietly, "I wish this had been handled differently from the beginning." I looked at her for a moment before answering. "So do I." That was all either of us needed to say. There was no satisfaction in seeing someone humbled by a process that could have been avoided with better decisions. My goal had never been to embarrass anyone. I had only wanted answers about my own property. Outside the meeting room, Mike caught up with me in the parking lot. He smiled as we walked toward our trucks. "You know," he said, "if you had started yelling on the first day, most people probably would have dismissed you." I laughed because he was right. "Instead," he continued, "you just kept asking for one piece of paper." I nodded. Because if everything had been done correctly, that paper should have existed. We stood there for another minute watching the evening sun settle over the neighborhood before heading home. A week later, I backed my truck onto the restored driveway for the first time. The concrete matched perfectly. The surface was smooth. The expansion joints were straight. You could barely tell any work had ever been done unless you knew where to look. I shut off the engine and remained in the driver's seat for a few moments, thinking back to the photographs Mike had sent me while I was hundreds of miles away. At the time, they had looked like the beginning of a story about damaged concrete. They had actually been the beginning of a story about missing documentation. The saw cuts, the orange paint, the contractor's hesitation, the unanswered emails, the missing permit number, the careful measurements, the county inspection, every small detail that had seemed insignificant at first eventually connected into one complete picture. Looking back, the greatest lesson had nothing to do with homeowners associations or construction projects. It was that confidence is never a substitute for documentation, and authority is never a substitute for accountability. Rules only protect people when everyone is expected to follow them equally. As I walked toward my front door, I glanced one last time at the clean stretch of concrete leading from the street to my garage. Most visitors would never notice anything unusual about it. I always would. Every time I drove across that driveway, I remembered that patience had accomplished what anger never could. I had not won because I argued louder. I had not won because I knew the right people. I had simply refused to stop asking one honest question until the answer existed in writing. In the end, the repaired driveway was not the most important thing the county restored. They restored confidence that the rules applied to everyone, including the people who believed they were above them. And that was a foundation far stronger than concrete.